The awareness of death came early for me. My earliest recollection of death's invasive finality involved pets. Maybe it does that with a lot of kids. I don't know why it seemed. I don't know if it was one mother dog who had several puppies or if it was several successive puppies. But I remember as a little teeny kid, as far back as I can remember, those little puppies finding their way behind a car tire and nobody seeing them first. It seems like many to me. Now, my mother might say it was only one. I think it was at least two. But it was enough to leave a big thing in me. The finality of death became real at a very young age. But in that same period of my young life, about 5 years of age, came the devastating loss of Roxanne, my dearest neighborhood friend and daily playmate. I still get a little choked up. She was apparently away at a camp with her family, and the news came back that Roxanne had drowned while swimming in the lake. And I was undone to the core. I still remember sitting on the curb in that little neighborhood in Michigan. And I know now that things can happen with embalming fluid, but when my mother let me go to the viewing at the funeral home, and I went and stood at her casket, one of those little caskets for smaller people. And her nose was running. And it just tore me again to the core, so much so that as a little 5-year-old, I went to the funeral director and said, "Her nose is running, please take care of it." And I know that it's, embalming fluid actually has to be stopped up in places where it might come out in the body, in those days at least. But I was undone to the core. And since those earliest memories, like you, the reality of death has never stopped invading. You see, because even though we live on this side of the cross, and even though we know that Jesus has been raised, we just celebrated it, right? This is why this is about, and I know some of you are thinking, where is he going with this? This is Easter. You've got to talk about the resurrection. Even though that we know that Jesus has been raised, even though we know by faith that in Christ, death has lost its eternally mortal sting, but friends, it still stings. Here and now. In some sense, our human experience has yet to catch up with the reality of our faith. Because we live here and now, in between the times. You see, like the women in this gospel story who lived between Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection, this discovery of the empty tomb, we too live in the interim. Our interim is a bit different. Our interim is actually the interim between Christ's death and resurrection on the one side and our own ultimate death and resurrection on the other. That's the space we're in. I mean, the final thing has happened. We celebrate it. We rejoice. We confess our faith and we give thanks to God, but we're still here and mortality is real. And only yards away from us, families are grieving this moment because of it. these women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women. The focus is clearly on the women. The men don't believe it. The women are there first. These women are models of faithful discipleship in the interim space of life. Or perhaps all the interim spaces of life, because there are a lot of interims that we find our way moving through in our lives. They are model disciples in those places. The space they inhabited between Friday and Sunday on our calendar is sort of a mirror, isn't it, of the space that we inhabit between Jesus' ascension and our own new creation. And how they responded, what they did in that space after the crucifixion and before they found the empty tomb, and I have to presume afterward, what they did in that interim space becomes a model for a way of being. It becomes a model for ways of engaging life in this interim space. Indeed, it's perhaps the earliest model of faithful discipleship in the New Testament for all the interim spaces of our lives. I just want to walk through this passage. Some of you are going to think it's strange, but I just want you to look at the verbs. the verbs that talk about these women. At first, maybe some of you who are keenly aware of how chapter 24 of Luke starts know that I sneaked in 3 more verses beginning at 55 of chapter 23, because there's verbs there. It first says that they followed in 23:55. So powerful was their commitment to Rabbi Jesus that they followed even a dead body to the tomb. Jesus had just been crucified, and these women, 3 whose names we know, others we don't, but we can presume who they might have been from other gospel accounts and narratives, they followed, indeed foreshadowing the commitment of other early followers of Jesus, St. Paul most notably, to know nothing but Christ and Him crucified. They followed a dead body to the tomb. And it says they followed and got there and they saw. They went there and they soaked in everything they could about the tomb and about the placement of Jesus' lifeless body. They were intentionally attentive. Sometimes we don't pay attention, do we? It's something we have to give. It's something we have to pay. And they were intentionally attentive in their followership of Christ, even at the tomb. And they saw what they saw, which I'll come back to in a moment later. But when they saw that, then they returned and began preparing. I mean, these are like some of the women I know. They never stop. They're doing something. They've got things to prepare for. I could name one of them right back here, who lives in my house. Always preparing for something next. And you see, these women, as quickly, they did all this quickly because they knew that the Sabbath was about to start when they could not do any preparation for anything. And so they hurried back from that empty tomb that they saw, because Sabbath was ready, it was about sundown, it was ready to break. And they got to work readying spices to be used to push back the stench of a decomposing body. That's what those spices were for. I don't know what that would have been like. Can you imagine whatever a first century kitchen in their town looked like? They were finding their spices and the right ones to mix together. They perhaps had a formula, a recipe. for these kinds of spices to put together, to do the best job. And then it says they rested because the Sabbath was there. Just think what this says about these women. They were faithfully, loyally living within the truth of God that they knew. These are women who are teetering between the old covenant and the new covenant. Where do they land right now in this account? But they were faithful to what they knew and understood of God. Friends, at the end of the day, that's all God asks of any of us. You don't have to know some secret knowledge. You don't have to recite some secret formula. But you have to live your life in faithfulness about what you do know and understand of God. You see, they model that. They lived their lives in faithful response to what was before them, both in their faith, in this case, the Old Covenant, and in the practices of their time and their culture. There's a dead body, and they knew what needed to be done, and they did it. That's what they did. You know, we make this thing so hard, but most of it's about faithfulness. It's about doing what is before us to do and doing it faithfully. And they did it all without knowing the big picture. They did it all without knowing how things would turn out. They are undoubtedly still mystified about what they had seen at the tomb. And then chapter 24 sort of breaks in, and they came. They came to the tomb. They had been there. Now they're back. Now they're coming to the tomb to do what they came to do. They showed up. They weren't scared away by what had happened. They showed up, even in the midst of devastation and sorrow and confusion and emptiness. They showed up. Oh, there's a lot to learn from these women. Just showing up is most often, in fact, almost always enough. They took those spices. They engaged in acts of faithfulness based on what they knew, as limited as it was. They found that tomb empty. You see, understanding or revelation for them was progressive. It wasn't all at once. We live in a culture of efficiency run amok and wanting answers instantly. But most things in life require a long view. God's not going to zap you with everything God's got right now. Friends, for most of us, it'll take a lifetime. Because the capacity of this vessel is frail. It's not a problem with God, it's a problem with the human vessel. The revelation for them was progressive, not all at once, as it is for us. And then it says they went in. They pushed forward into the tomb based on what they knew, not waiting for all the answers. Oh, the perfectionists among us must have it all figured out before we can take a step. Not these women. They lived, they responded on the basis of what they knew, and they remembered. For them, faith was not static, but growing and developing and changing and maturing. They drew lines from what they now remembered Jesus having said to them and tied it to what was going on now. And things began to be woven together in their understanding. You know, it's that way for us also, isn't it? Our faith is never once and done, but it's a lifelong weaving of a tapestry of faithfulness to God and to others. And it adds up to faith. And they returned. I just think, we could follow that little word return throughout chapters, other places too, but throughout chapters 23 and 24 of Luke, where this community, it's going to happen. It happened in verse 56 that we saw. It happens in verse 33, where the people on the road to Emmaus go with Jesus, and then they return to Jerusalem. It's going to happen later in 24:52, where people returned. What? They're tethered to a central location and a community. That's where their strength comes from. They aren't lone rangers. They aren't people who are trying to do it all on their own, but they're bound together with a community. And by the way, that community was just as disillusioned, confused, dismayed, seeking to understand as they were. And yet, that's where they found their strength. And then finally, they told. They bore witness to what they had found, an empty tomb, and to what they did not find, a body, and what they had seen, two men in dazzling clothes, and what they had heard. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here, he has risen. Remember what he told you. You know, on this Easter season, you may be feeling the weight of the world, or the weight of your own mortality, or someone whom you love. And we all probably know that we live in uncertain times. And one of the messages, thankfully not the only one, but one of the key ones, is that trust in God does not and will not provide all the answers to the particularities of our present circumstances, yours or mine or our world's. But it does, and it will provide the way of being in the midst of the interim spaces of our lives. The good news of Jesus' resurrection is that, like these faithful women who straddled the faith of the Old Testament and the New Testament, we can trust God's presence and lean on God's ultimate healing, promise of healing for our lives and our loved ones and for all creation. Thanks be to God. Amen.